Sometimes love doesn't arrive when we expect it. It doesn't always appear in our 20s when life is loud and everything feels possible. Sometimes love waits. It waits until life has already tested you, until your heart has been broken, until you've learned how to live without expecting anyone to stay. And then, one quiet day, when you are no longer searching for it, love appears again. At 56 years old, Linda believed that part of her life was already over. Her children were grown, her marriage had ended years ago, and the idea of falling in love again felt like something that belonged to younger people. But one unexpected meeting at a small neighborhood cafe would soon remind her of something she had forgotten, that the heart doesn't measure time the way we do, and sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin when we least expect them. For most of her adult life, Linda had believed that love was something that only happened once. Not because she was a romantic, but because life had simply turned out that way. She had married in her late 20s. Back then, everything felt simple. Two people building a life together. A small house, shared dreams, children laughing in the backyard. For many years, that life felt complete. Her days were filled with the familiar rhythm of family life, packing lunches in the morning, driving her children to school, evenings spent around the dinner table sharing stories about the day. Like many mothers, Linda didn't spend much time thinking about herself. Her happiness came from watching her children grow, and for a long time, that was enough. But life has a way of changing quietly. Sometimes the changes are small, a little more distance between conversations, longer silences at the dinner table, moments when two people realize they are no longer walking in the same direction. By the time Linda was in her late 40s, her marriage had slowly come to an end. There was no dramatic fight, no sudden betrayal, just the quiet understanding that the life they had built together had reached its final chapter. The divorce was calm, respectful, but it still left an emptiness that took years to fully understand. At first, Linda focused on what mattered most, her children. They were teenagers then, preparing for their own futures, college applications, new opportunities, dreams that stretched far beyond the small town where they had grown up. Linda supported them the way she always had, encouraging them to chase their dreams, helping them prepare for the lives waiting ahead. And eventually, just like every parent knows will happen someday, they left home. One by one, her children moved into their own lives, apartments in new cities, new careers, new relationships. Linda was proud of them, truly proud, but the house felt different after they were gone. Not sad exactly, just quieter. The kind of quiet that makes you notice things you hadn't paid attention to before. The sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. The way sunlight moved slowly across the living room floor in the afternoon. The silence during dinner when no one was there to ask, "What's for dessert?" At first, Linda filled her time with practical things. Work, exercise, occasional visits with friends. Her life was stable, comfortable, predictable, and she told herself that was enough. The idea of dating again had crossed her mind once or twice. Friends would sometimes suggest it. "You should meet someone," they would say. But Linda always laughed it off. Dating felt like something people in their 30s did, not women in their 50s. Besides, she had grown used to her independence. Her evenings were peaceful. She could read for hours without interruption, watch the movies she liked, take long walks without worrying about anyone else's schedule. In many ways, she had built a life that felt calm and safe. And after everything she had experienced, calm felt good. Love, on the other hand, felt uncertain, complicated, risky. So Linda stopped thinking about it altogether. If love happened again someday, that would be nice. But if it didn't, she believed she would still be okay. That quiet acceptance became part of her life, until one ordinary afternoon changed everything. It happened on a Saturday, the kind of slow weekend afternoon when the town felt almost sleepy. Linda had spent the morning cleaning the house and decided to take a short walk downtown. There was a small cafe she liked to visit occasionally. Nothing fancy, just a cozy place with large windows and good coffee. When she stepped inside, the warm smell of fresh espresso filled the room. A few people sat at small wooden tables, some reading, some working quietly on laptops. Linda ordered a cup of coffee and looked around for a place to sit. That's when she noticed the only empty seat left in the cafe. It was at a small table by the window, and someone was already sitting there. A man about her age, gray hair, kind eyes, reading a book while slowly sipping his coffee. He looked up when she approached. Their eyes met for just a moment, and something about the quiet warmth in his smile made Linda pause. "Would you like to sit?" he asked, moving his book aside to make room at the table. Linda hesitated for a second, then she smiled politely. "Thank you." At that moment, she believed it was simply a small act of kindness from a stranger, a brief conversation over coffee, nothing more. She had no way of knowing that this simple moment would soon change the way she thought about love and about her life forever. For a few moments after Linda sat down at the small cafe table, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens naturally between two strangers who are both comfortable with stillness. The man closed his book gently and placed it beside his coffee cup. "I hope you don't mind sharing the table," he said with a warm smile. "Not at all," Linda replied. "It's a busy afternoon here." She wrapped her hands around the warm coffee mug the barista had just placed in front of her. For a moment, she simply enjoyed the warmth and the quiet hum of the cafe. Outside the large window, people passed by slowly along the street. A couple walked their dog. A young mother pushed a stroller. The world felt calm and ordinary. "Good book?" Linda asked, nodding toward the novel resting on the table. The man smiled slightly. "It's one of my favorites. I've probably read it 3 times already." "That must mean it's good." "It reminds me that life is never really finished surprising us," he said. Linda chuckled softly. "That sounds optimistic." He lifted his shoulders in a small shrug. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just learned that life doesn't follow the plans we make for it." Linda felt something about that sentence linger in her mind. Life doesn't follow the plans we make. She understood that better than most people. "I suppose that's true," she said. The man extended his hand politely. "I'm David." "Linda," she replied, shaking his hand. There was something gentle about his presence. Nothing overly confident, nothing forced, just calm. They talked for a few minutes about simple things, the cafe, the neighborhood, the unusually warm weather for early spring. David explained that he had recently moved to the area after retiring from a long career as a high school history teacher. "I spent 35 years explaining the past to teenagers who mostly wanted to be anywhere else," he said with a laugh. Linda smiled. "That sounds like a difficult audience." "It was," he admitted, "but occasionally one of them actually listened. And that made it worth it?" "Exactly." Linda found herself relaxing into the conversation more easily than she expected. Normally, she was polite but reserved with strangers. But something about David's quiet way of speaking made the conversation feel easy. "What about you?" he asked. "Have you lived here long?" "Almost 25 years, Linda said. "Then you must know all the best places in town." "Some of them," she said with a small smile. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "My children grew up here." David nodded thoughtfully. "Do they still live nearby?" "No," she said. "They both moved away after college, different cities." "That must have been a big adjustment." "It was," Linda admitted. "But it's also what you hope for as a parent, that they build their own lives." David leaned back slightly in his chair. You sound proud of them. I am. For a moment, the conversation slowed again, but this time the silence felt comfortable. David looked at her thoughtfully. I imagine the house must feel quieter now. Linda laughed softly. That's one way to describe it. There was no sadness in her voice, just honesty. David nodded. I understand that kind of quiet. Linda looked at him curiously. You do? My wife passed away 5 years ago, he said gently. I'm sorry, Linda said immediately. Thank you, he replied. It was a difficult time, but life has a way of slowly teaching you how to move forward. Linda noticed that he spoke about it calmly, not with bitterness, not with heaviness, just acceptance. That must have taken strength, she said. David looked down at his coffee cup. More patience than strength. They both smiled quietly at that. The conversation drifted again to lighter topics. Books, favorite travel destinations, the strange ways small towns change over time. Before Linda realized it, almost an hour had passed. She glanced at the clock on the wall. I didn't realize how long I've been here, she said. David looked surprised too. That's usually a sign of good conversation. Linda gathered her bag and stood. I should probably get going. David stood as well. It was really nice meeting you, Linda. You too. For a brief moment, they both paused. Then David said something that surprised her. Would you like to have coffee again sometime? The question was simple. Not pushy, not dramatic, just an invitation. Linda felt a small flutter of uncertainty inside her. It had been many years since anyone had asked her that question. Part of her instinct was to politely decline. Life felt comfortable the way it was, safe, predictable. But another part of her hesitated, because the conversation had felt natural, easy, and something about David's quiet kindness had stayed with her. She looked at him for a moment, then she smiled. I think I'd like that. David's smile widened slightly. Good. They exchanged phone numbers before leaving the cafe. As Linda stepped outside into the soft afternoon sunlight, she felt something she hadn't expected. A lightness. Not excitement exactly, not yet, just a gentle curiosity about what might happen next. For years, Linda had believed that the chapter of her life that included romance had quietly ended. But as she walked down the familiar street toward home, she realized something surprising. For the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to the possibility of something new. And sometimes, possibility is where every love story begins. For the next few days, Linda found herself thinking about that afternoon at the cafe more often than she expected. It wasn't because anything dramatic had happened. There had been no grand romantic moment, no sudden emotional confession, just two people sharing a table, a conversation, and an unexpected sense of ease. But somehow, that simple hour had stayed with her. On Monday morning, while she was watering the small plants on her kitchen windowsill, she noticed herself smiling at the memory of something David had said. Life doesn't follow the plans we make for it. She had repeated that sentence in her mind several times since their conversation. Because if there was one thing Linda understood deeply, it was that life rarely unfolds the way we expect. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen. It was a message from David. Hello, Linda. I hope your week is going well. I enjoyed our conversation on Saturday. If you're free sometime this week, I'd love to continue it over another cup of coffee. Linda read the message twice. Then she smiled. There was something refreshing about how simple it was. No pressure, no overly clever lines, just a genuine invitation. She set the phone down for a moment and walked toward the living room window. Outside, the street was quiet as usual. A neighbor was mowing his lawn. A delivery truck passed slowly down the road. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the week before. But somehow, Linda felt slightly different. For years, her life had followed a steady rhythm. Work, home, occasional dinners with friends, quiet evenings with a book. There was comfort in that routine. But there was also a certain predictability. And this message, this small, unexpected moment, felt like a tiny ripple in that calm routine. After a few minutes, Linda picked up her phone again and replied, "I enjoyed it too. Coffee sounds nice." They agreed to meet on Wednesday afternoon. The next 2 days passed quickly. Linda didn't tell anyone about the meeting, not because it was a secret, but because she wasn't even sure how to describe it. Was it a date? That word felt strange. At 56, she hadn't used it in many years, so she simply thought of it as meeting a new friend. On Wednesday afternoon, Linda arrived at the café a few minutes early. She chose the same small table by the window where they had met before. The familiar smell of coffee filled the room. For a moment, she felt slightly nervous. It had been a long time since she had cared about making a good impression. But when David walked in a few minutes later, the nervousness faded almost immediately. He smiled when he saw her. "I'm glad you came," he said as he sat down. "I am too," Linda replied. This time, their conversation flowed even more naturally. They talked about the small details of their lives, favorite childhood memories, places they had traveled, books they loved. David told her stories about his years teaching history. Some of them are funny, others were thoughtful. Linda shared stories about raising her children, the chaos of school mornings, family road trips, the strange mixture of pride and sadness when children finally grow up and leave home. David listened carefully, not just politely, but with genuine interest. At one point, he said something that surprised her. "You speak about your children with so much warmth. They must be very lucky." Linda looked down at her coffee cup for a moment. "I was the lucky one," she said quietly. "They gave my life meaning during years when I needed it most." David nodded slowly. "I understand that." They spent nearly 2 hours talking, and when they finally stood up to leave, Linda noticed something surprising. The world outside the cafe felt a little brighter. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, David hesitated for a moment. "Would you like to go for a walk?" he asked. "It's a beautiful afternoon." Linda looked up at the sky. The late afternoon sun had begun to soften into that golden color that appears just before evening. "Yes," she said. "A walk sounds nice." They walked slowly through the small park near the cafe. The trees were just beginning to show the first signs of spring leaves. Children played near the swings. A few elderly couples sat quietly on benches. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made time feel slower. At one point, David turned to her and said something thoughtful. "You know, most people spend their lives trying to avoid change." Linda glanced at him. "That sounds like something a history teacher would say." He laughed. "Maybe it is." Then he added gently, "But sometimes change is exactly what brings the most beautiful parts of life." Linda didn't answer immediately, because somewhere deep inside, she knew he was right. For many years, she had believed that the most meaningful chapters of her life were already behind her. Her marriage, raising her children, building a family. But now, walking beside this kind and thoughtful man on a quiet afternoon, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Curiosity. Not about the past, but about the future. And that feeling alone surprised her. Because for the first time in many years, Linda realized that her life might still hold new stories she had never imagined. And sometimes, the most unexpected stories begin with something as simple as a second cup of coffee. In the weeks that followed, Linda and David began to see each other more often. At first, it was always something simple. coffee on a quiet afternoon, a walk through the park near the café. Sometimes they visited a small bookstore downtown and spent an hour talking about the novels they loved. There was never any pressure between them, no expectations, just the comfortable rhythm of two people slowly getting to know each other. And that was something Linda appreciated more than she could explain, because at this stage of her life, she wasn't looking for excitement. She wasn't searching for the kind of intense romance that people often experience when they are young. What she valued now was something different: peace, honesty, kindness. And with David, those things seemed to appear naturally. One Saturday afternoon, they decided to visit a local farmers market that took place every weekend in the town square. The place was full of small stands selling fresh vegetables, homemade bread, and flowers. Music played softly from a small corner where a street musician was performing with a guitar. Linda loved places like this. They reminded her of the simple joys of everyday life. As they walked between the stalls, David picked up a small bouquet of wildflowers from one of the vendors. Without saying much, he handed them to her. Linda looked at the flowers, slightly surprised. "You didn't have to do that," she said. David smiled gently. "I know." She laughed softly. The gesture was simple, but it warmed her heart in a quiet way. For years, Linda had lived a life focused on responsibility: work, family, schedules. Moments like this, small and thoughtful, had slowly disappeared over time. But standing there in the warm sunlight with a small bouquet of flowers in her hand, she realized something. It felt nice to be seen again. Later that afternoon, they sat on a bench at the edge of the market, watching people pass by. Families with children, young couples holding hands, friends laughing together. David looked thoughtful for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Were you ever afraid to start over after your divorce?" Linda thought about the question carefully. "For a long time, yes," she admitted. "Not because I was lonely, but because I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be anymore." David nodded slowly. "That makes sense. When you spend years building a life around other people, it's strange when that life suddenly changes." Linda looked out across the busy square. "For a while, I thought that part of my life was finished," she said. "The part where you fall in love." David didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he looked at her with a calm and thoughtful expression. "And now?" he asked quietly. Linda hesitated. She wasn't used to answering questions like that anymore, but something about David made honesty feel easy. "Now, I think life might still have surprises left." David smiled. "I'm glad to hear that." As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, they continued walking through the town. Eventually, they reached the small river that ran along the edge of the park. The water moved gently beneath the wooden bridge. The golden light of sunset reflected softly across the surface. They leaned against the railing, watching the quiet flow of the river. After a few minutes, David spoke again. "You know, when my wife passed away, I believed something similar." Linda turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "I believed that the part of my life that included love was over." He spoke calmly, without sadness, just honesty. "For a long time, I was comfortable being alone," he continued. "I focused on my work, on reading, on traveling a little." Linda listened quietly. "And then one day," he said with a small smile, "I met someone interesting at a café." Linda laughed softly. "That sounds familiar." "It does, doesn't it?" They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then David said something that made her heart pause. "I'm really glad you sat down at that table that day." Linda looked out across the river again. "So am I." For the first time in many years, she felt something growing quietly inside her. Not excitement, not nervousness, but something deeper: trust. Because what they were building didn't feel rushed. It didn't feel fragile. It felt steady, like something that had arrived at exactly the right moment. And as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees, Linda realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. Love wasn't something that only belonged to youth. It wasn't limited by age. Sometimes, love simply arrives later in life, when the heart is wiser, when the expectations are quieter, and when two people are finally ready to appreciate it. But what Linda didn't yet realize was that the most important moment in their story was still waiting just ahead, and it would soon change the way she saw love forever. As summer slowly arrived, Linda and David's friendship deepened into something that felt quietly meaningful. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden declarations of love, just time. Time spent talking, walking, laughing, and slowly learning about each other's lives. And somehow, that simplicity made everything feel more real. For Linda, the most surprising part was how natural everything felt. For years, she had believed that love belonged to the past, something she had experienced once in her youth, something that had shaped an important chapter of her life, but something that was now finished. Yet here she was, sitting on her porch one warm evening, thinking about David in a way that made her smile without even realizing it. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. It was a message from him. "Would you like to join me for dinner tomorrow evening? There's a small restaurant by the river I think you'd enjoy." Linda read the message slowly. Then she looked up at the quiet sky above her home. For a moment, she remembered the woman she had been just a year earlier, a woman who had accepted that her life would likely remain calm and predictable, a woman who believed that the most exciting chapters of her story had already been written. And now, something new had quietly entered her life. Not loudly, not dramatically, just gently. She replied to the message with a simple answer. "I'd like that." The next evening, David picked her up just before sunset. They drove to a small restaurant that overlooked the river they had once walked beside weeks earlier. The place was quiet. Soft music played in the background. Small candles flickered on each table. As they sat down, Linda felt an unusual mixture of calm and anticipation. It had been many years since she had shared a dinner like this with someone who truly wanted to know her. Throughout the evening, their conversation moved easily from one topic to another. They talked about travel dreams, about the strange ways life teaches patience, about the lessons people learn after experiencing loss and change. At one point, David looked at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said gently, "meeting you has reminded me of something." "What's that?" Linda asked. "That life doesn't stop offering new beginnings just because we've reached a certain age." Linda smiled. "I think I'm learning that too." After dinner, they walked slowly along the river path outside the restaurant. The evening air was cool and peaceful. The lights from the town reflected softly across the water. They stopped near the same wooden bridge where they had once stood together weeks earlier. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David turned toward her. "I want to tell you something," he said. Linda felt her heart beat a little faster. "I'm listening." "When we first met, I thought it would simply be a pleasant conversation between two strangers," he said. "But over the past few weeks, I've realized something." "What's that?" she asked softly. "I've realized that I look forward to every moment I spend with you." Linda felt warmth rise in her chest. David continued gently. "I'm not interested in rushing anything, and I know we've both lived full lives before this." He paused for a moment. "But I would really like to see where this could go, if you feel the same way." Linda looked at him quietly. In that moment, many thoughts passed through her mind. The years she had spent believing that love was no longer part of her future. The quiet evenings she had accepted as the natural shape of her life. The peace she had built on her own. And now, this unexpected possibility standing in front of her. She realized something important. Loving again didn't mean forgetting the past. It didn't mean replacing the life she had lived before. It simply meant allowing a new chapter to begin. And sometimes the most beautiful chapters come later in life. She smiled gently. I think I'd like to see where it goes too. David's expression softened with relief. They continued standing there beside the river, watching the slow movement of the water beneath the bridge. For Linda, the moment felt surprisingly calm, not overwhelming, not frightening, just hopeful. Because this time, love felt different. It wasn't about building a life from nothing. It wasn't about chasing dreams the way she had when she was young. This time, love felt like two people who had already lived long journeys, finally meeting at the right moment. Later that night, as Linda returned home, she sat quietly in her living room for a few minutes. The house was just as peaceful as it had been before, but something inside her had changed. She no longer saw her life as something that had already reached its most important chapters. Instead, she understood something beautiful. Life continues to surprise us, even after 50, even after heartbreak, even after we believe the story is finished. Because sometimes the most meaningful love stories begin later in life, not when we are searching for them, but when we are finally ready to appreciate them. And at 56 years old, Linda had just discovered something she never expected. Love had found her again. And this time, it felt exactly like it was meant to.